Welcome to How the World Works. I'm Kevin Williamson, a writer in residence here at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and this is a podcast where we talk about work. Sometimes we talk about our jobs and jobs we've had and what they're like. Sometimes we talk about the meaning of work and its role in our lives and society. We try to operate off the theory that there's more to work than just the paycheck we get, although we're all very grateful for our paychecks, I'm sure. Work is a way that we organize our lives and create meaning and value, and partly how we organize our society and take care of one another. And those ideas all come from a fellow called Adam Smith. Or at least they were certainly popularized by him, and they entered my life that way. And that makes me very especially happy today to have with us Jim Otteson. Do you go by Jim or James?
I go by Jim. My full
Jim
name is James, but please call me Jim.
of Notre Dame, and he is known in the world as the Adam Smith guy, who has written and spoken a great deal about Adam Smith. But like Adam Smith, he's not really an economist, although he writes and talks a lot about economic ideas. He is a philosopher and a professor of business ethics, I believe it is, there at Notre Dame.
Right.
And some of us have always assumed that business ethics was one of those things like, military intelligence that's just an oxymoron. But no, I'm kidding about that. Most business guys I know actually think in a more active way about the ethics of their work and their businesses than one might expect them to. And particularly guys who are like in the most sort of famously amoral fields like finance and real estate development and things like that. They also they actually tend to think about this stuff a little bit more. So before we get into talking about maybe some of Smith's ideas about work and the butcher and the baker and the brewer and that great paragraph, which is very important to me and I hold dear to my heart. You've had an unusual career path yourself. Tell us a little bit about how you got where you are.
I'm happy to. Thank you, first of all, for having me. I've been a long time reader. I've learned a great deal from you over the years, so it's a real honor and a pleasure to be with you.
Wonderful,
Um,
thank you.
yeah, I was the first person in my family to go to college, so I didn't know much about what college was for. And when I got to college, I thought you would either become a lawyer or a doctor. Those were the two things you could go to college to become. And so I thought about both of those, while a student, I was asked, as all the students were, we had to take these university seminars as freshmen, and the one I was assigned to was taught by a classics professor, where we read Homer and Plato, and I had never read anything like that before. They completely changed the direction of my life, my career. I ended up majoring in the program of liberal studies at Notre Dame. I was an undergraduate at Notre Dame, which is their great books program. And I studied philosophy as well, and then went on to philosophy graduate school to get my PhD. And there I still didn't really know what it was I wanted to do. I was interested in David Hume. He was sort of my philosophical hero. Loved reading, and I still to this day love reading David Hume. And when I was writing my dissertation, or thinking about what I was going to write for my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, I was sort of casting around for topics because, lots of people, everybody was writing on Hume, and there was a lot that was written already, and I was trying to think of a new angle, and I discovered by accident, or at least to me by accident, that Hume had been friends with somebody else I had heard of called Adam Smith. And I thought, well, any friend of Hume's is a friend of mine, and so I decided to investigate into this Adam Smith a bit. As an undergraduate, I had read some excerpts from The Wealth of Nations, and I remembered the phrase invisible hand, but I didn't really remember much else about it, Smith. But in looking into it, I discovered that he wrote another book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and that was actually his first book, and the one that really made his name, both in the British Isles and on the continent, the European continent. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. I'd never even heard of that book, and I decided to go ahead and read it. And couldn't believe my eyes. It was so full of insights, and there was some overlap and some connections to Hume, but taking it much further and in some different directions. Really, I think, now especially looking back on it, inaugurating something like a new school or a new approach to moral philosophy. And when I went to look to see what other philosophers were writing about Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, I found that it was basically nothing. There was almost nobody writing about him. There were some economists who wrote about Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, but economists, for all of their virtues, are not the best scholars. They weren't really reading the theory of moral sentiments, and so I thought this was an opportunity. So I decided to focus my dissertation on Adam Smith, my dissertation advisor at the time gave me the advice, probably good advice in retrospect. He said, "Don't write your dissertation only on Adam Smith because nobody will hire you. So make it on Adam Smith and David Hume." So that's what I did. I did a sort of comparison of their two approaches to moral philosophy. But that was in, so I came out of as a PhD in philosophy with a stated expertise in 18th century British moral philosophy, which you might think has not a lot to do with business ethics or economics. And so it really was a strange series of accidents, really. Studying Hume and Smith got me interested in from their moral philosophy, got me interested in their what I would call, or what we might call, their political philosophy, the kind of liberalism that was developing out of 18th century Britain and 19th century Britain. That got me interested in the economics that they were recommending. So I started thinking about the history of economic thought, and eventually, now skipping forward several years, that got me an invitation to begin teaching the history of economic thought in economics departments, and connecting it with moral philosophy, the work I had done in moral philosophy. And that now is what's brought me to Notre Dame as a professor of business ethics.
There was a novel I was just reading because my life is a little too busy right now. The title and the author both just dropped out of my head as soon as I tried to think of them. I'll
Okay.
put it in the show notes, but it's one of these great novels about academic life, and it starts off with this kid who's from a family of farmers, largely uneducated people, first one in his family to go to college, and he's there to study agriculture. And it's sort of similar to your story in a way. He discovers literature and switches his major. And there's this very awkward conversation where he has to go back and explain to his parents that he's actually studying poetry and not farming, and that he's going to do something else with his life. Was there a conversation like that for you where you had to go tell your father or someone, I'm not actually going to be a doctor or a lawyer, I'm going to switch to philosophy, which always sounds like I've taken a vow of poverty to people?
Yes. Yeah, in some ways, it's the worst of all possible worlds. So I was raised by a single mother, and my father, I had come to know who he was, but he wasn't really a part of my life at this time. But I did have a conversation with him nonetheless when I told him that I was going to get a PhD in philosophy. And he said, "Well, what is that exactly?" And I said, "Well, it's this degree that you get where at the end of it, you're an expert in something." And he said, "And would people call you doctor?" And I said, "Well, it is a doctoral degree." And he said, "So my son's going to be a doctor?" I think he might have had something else in mind. I said, "Well, not the kind that can help you. I'm probably the kind that, if anything, would cause you pain and suffering." I'm not sure that, and then not to give you too many details, private details or personal details, but he passed away tragically at a relatively young age. It was shortly after I had finished my degree.
Mm.
Um, but my mother, I would say, although a little bit uncertain about the course of life I was taking, I think she's decided that since I was able to actually get a job and become a professor and support a family, that that's pretty good. So I think she has become proud of me.
Yeah, you traditionally saw this, and you still see it, I think, with immigrants from poor countries or from relatively poor backgrounds, where there's a great deal of suspicion of higher education that isn't explicitly oriented toward a profession.
Mhm.
I mean, the cliche, of course, is Jewish immigrant families whose children all become doctors or maybe lawyers, but mainly doctors. But you see this in immigrants from the Caribbean who they don't tend to major in art history.
Yeah.
A lot of
Yeah.
things like that. They are, and people from South Asia, even though they're largely, if they're studying in the United States, not often from poor families themselves, but from relatively poor societies. And so they study computer science and engineering and law and medicine and things like that.
Mhm.
And there is I think even in the wider society, particularly outside of the realm of people who have a lot of experience with higher education, this notion that if your degree doesn't have like a job in it, like in the title, like I went to law school so I could become a lawyer,
Mhm.
that it's economically worthless or at least economically less valuable. And of course, if when you get out in the world, you suddenly notice that there's the guy who's the vice president of this company who was he majored in French or sociology or something in college, or majored in art history, but he did it at Harvard, so that made a difference.
Mhm.
And that these things are not related in the strictly linear way that people often tend to think they are. And when people are trying to think of cliched examples of useless or eccentric or non-practical majors. Philosophy is one that comes up a lot,
Yes,
if not
yes.
French literature.
Yeah.
But of course, in the real world, philosophy is actually, even undergraduate degrees in philosophy can be pretty useful. A lot of people go from there to law school.
Mhm.
Some of these stricter and more quantitative forms of philosophy bring people into the world of technology and computer science and things like
Mhm.
that. So what is the economic value of philosophy these days?
The economic value. Well, if what you're thinking about doing in pursuing a philosophy degree is becoming a philosophy professor, then I would say that's you should consider philosophy graduate school as a consumption good, and if anything, it's a downwardly mobile career path. There aren't a lot of philosophy. There are many more people who would like to study philosophy than there are positions as philosophy professors. So that's probably not, if you're interested in economics, that's probably not the path for you. But I will say that I think, philosophy, especially among the other humanities disciplines, one of the things it can do is train you in rigorous thinking, careful thinking, drawing fine distinctions, and that can serve a person well in a lot of fields. So a friend of mine who came out of the University of Chicago in the same class that I did went into options trading. And he
Hmm.
didn't know anything about options trading, but he was quick and he was smart, and he was able to see the consequences of things just a fraction of a second quicker than other people saw the consequences of potential courses of action. And so that served him very well. So I think philosophy can serve as training for that could be valuable in many fields. Maybe with the potential exception of actually becoming a philosophy professor.
Yeah, professorships are it's not a terrible living for a lot of people. I mean, it's a nice job that pays reasonably well in
If
a
you
lot
can
of
get it,
circumstances.
if you can get it, it's
Right, there
nice
just
work
aren't
if
a
you
lot
can
of
get
them
it.
out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just not a lot of them out
But
there.
if I could say one other thing, though, Kevin, about you were talking about some of the approaches that immigrants take, especially for when their children go to college. One thing that made me think of is that a lot of students in business now, so students I have now in business, many of them want to major in finance. And they
Hmm.
give a slightly different reason for it, but I think it's connected with what you were saying, which is that they think that they owe their parents a return on their parents' investment. So if my parents spent X number of dollars to send me to some prestigious college or university, then it's my responsibility as a good child to repay that. And I think they think of that repayment in terms of dollars. So rather than some other way of just being successful or excellent at what I do, I need to somehow get a return on that investment of the money. And college and university tuition being what it is, that's a pretty significant. That can be a very significant investment. And so I think many of them feel an obligation to go into high-paying, highly remunerative jobs for that reason, just to pay back their parents.
Yeah, I have this longstanding theory that the most powerful but unremarked on factor and influence in American politics is varying degrees of personal risk aversion.
Oh.
And people who are really, really risk positive tend to lean in a more libertarian direction. People who are really, really risk averse tend to lean in a more welfare state direction, including, very well informed, intelligent people who understand things that, like, a government run healthcare system will be more expensive, less innovative, and maybe of lower quality, but it'll always kind of be there. Some basic level of service will always be there, and they're willing to make that trade off. And I don't necessarily think that's an irrational trade off. I think it has to do with values about how much you feel good about risk. And I think there's also a community version of risk aversion that you see, and it's maybe you see it in immigrant communities simply because it's more visible there, because by the nature of immigrant communities, they're more culturally alike than other groups of Americans are with one another. And so you know that if you want to be a billionaire, you have to go start a company.
Mhm.
That's how you make a lot of money in the United States, which is a very risky thing to do. But if you go become a doctor, you maybe not you don't get super rich, but you never starve to death either. My colleague Jonah Goldberg makes this point a lot about immigrants and becoming doctors and lawyers, and I think that holds true across different social groups in the United States, and people who grow up, particularly with low income backgrounds. often become very, very economically risk averse, especially if they end up relatively high income themselves. People who come from really, really poor backgrounds and, they go to college and they go to law school and they end up making a couple $100,000 a year. They often are very, very risk averse people.
Yeah.
Not to take us off in a whole weird tangent, but one of the things I found in some of my research on this that was interesting is that African American households with incomes similar to those of white households will have lower wealth than their similar income white households. And that's largely driven by having much more conservative investment strategies. That relatively high income African American households will invest disproportionately in bonds and government securities and things like that, and less in aggressive things like stocks. And
And you
so
think
you've
that's
got two
because of
households.
the differing risk aversion levels of risk
Yeah,
aversion?
African Americans tend to be relatively risk averse. Women tend to be relatively risk averse compared to men. And you see a similar situation there that women of a certain income will often end up with lower overall wealth than men with similar incomes. And I think it's just interesting how that sort of works out in broader society. One
Well,
of those underappreciated factors.
yeah, well, if you have been poor, or if you grew up poor, if you faced actual poverty, not the sort of stylized poverty we sometimes see in Hollywood movies, but actual poverty, where you don't know if you're going to be able to eat today. The downside risk of living like that again is very salient, and I can imagine
Yes.
that people are going to think to themselves, yeah, you can tell me about rational expectation, and I can do that calculation about expected value. If I do this, then I could get this. But on the other hand, even a small non-zero chance of losing what I have is much more salient than some much greater gain that I could expect to see by taking a larger risk.
Yeah, I think that actually holds probably true on sort of country by country stuff as well. In the United States, because we're such a wealthy, prosperous, sort of easygoing society in lots of ways, that the difference between being in the 60th percentile and the 40th percentile, I mean, it's big,
Mhm.
but it's not, I'm hungry.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
that I don't have a place to live. It's like I live in a less good neighborhood
Right.
and I drive a less good car.
My car is
But
4 years old, not 2 years old.
yeah, or 10 years old, I mean,
Even 10. Mm.
whatever it is. But if you're in Pakistan, the difference between 60th percentile and 40th percentile between a bit above average and a bit below average is pretty significant.
Mhm.
I think probably in a lot of ways, and you see that in some other countries, which I just think leads to different sorts of outcomes for kind of young strivers and recent
Yeah,
graduates and
and
everything.
understandably. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that the mistake we make is thinking that people who have different risk appetites than ours are irrational, rather than they just have different risk appetites and they're pursuing different goals in a different way. And I've taken us way off topic, but I think that's an interesting subject, and maybe we'll get back to it one of these days. So one of the famous Adam Smith lines, and one that's always, in the back of my head, it's never more than a minute away from what I'm thinking about probably, is the famous line that it's not from the goodness of the butcher or the baker or the brewer that we expect to get our dinner, but their self-interest. And when people see a line like that or read a line like that, they often think of it as cynical. Is this idea that only selfishness matters, it's selfishness that rules the world. And I don't think that's exactly right. I don't think that's how you read that sentence, and I don't think that's how those sentences were meant to be read. What he's getting at there, I think, is this point that you see, of course, much more developed later in Hayek and some other writers like that in Mises, that when you let people specialize and compete and let markets operate, that people realize that they can generate good things for themselves by generating good things for other people, by providing some real value or service. And the part where freedom and choice comes into this is that people get to make their own decisions about what it is they actually value. When you've got some old Soviet style system where you have a government that's setting wages and deciding who goes into what occupations, there's room for, favoritism and corruption and all that. Whereas if you have an actual competitive market, you really get to see what it is people actually value. Now, sometimes that'll horrify you. You know,
Sometimes it should horrify you.
yeah, I mean, we're doing pretty well over at the Dispatch, which is my main thing. But I guarantee you, our web traffic is not a thousandth of a percent of a rounding error on like the sixth biggest porn site on the internet, or something like that. People actually value what they value. But I think it is worthwhile to have that incentive and that mechanism there, of course, to really tell you this is what people actually value. And when you're a company, and it's easy to hate Amazon, it's easy to hate Walmart or something like that, and it's much easier to hate them when you have them around. People who experience not having those things around, of course, tend to appreciate them, I think, a little bit more. But there's a real kind of measurable, documentable way in which they give people things they actually want and they actually value and they actually care about. And that has just enormous consequences for making a society wealthier and better off. And I think more cooperative. We often emphasize the competitive nature of capitalism. And of course, competition is a big part of how it works, but competition is sort of procedural in capitalism, almost in a sense. It's instrumental. It's how we figure out what it is people actually value and whether we're any good at doing it. But looked at another from another point of view, it is the most cooperative thing the world has ever come up with, where we have this amazing, worldwide system of people cooperating, sometimes without even understanding that they're doing it, from different countries and cultures, often from peoples who don't particularly like one another, in some cases, who regard one another as enemies, and yet they manage to cooperate to improve everyone's standard of living. I know I'm giving kind of a little bit of a libertarian eye pencil lecture there, but it's true, and I think that's what Smith was really getting at, and I think that's a misunderstood point. So since you're the actual expert on this subject, though, why don't you hold forth?
Well, I like your reading of that passage. I would put another piece on that, and let me come at it by way of a Marxian critique. So Karl Marx read The Wealth of Nations, or at least he read this far in The Wealth of Nations, in his 1844 manuscript. So we have his manuscripts from 1844, which were really just his notes that he was writing as he was reading through various political economists, as he called them, including James Mill and Adam Smith. And here's a criticism that he raised of this passage, of this discussion from Adam Smith. What he said was, it sounds as if, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm putting in my own words, but he says, it sounds as if what Smith is saying is that what you get in a market economy is transactions are only executed. Partnerships, trades, any kind of transactions are only executed if they're A, mutually voluntary, and B, mutually beneficial. So that's the great virtue of what Smith is talking about, that both sides have to say yes, neither is coerced into the exchange, and either side has the opt-out option of saying no thanks if they didn't think that the trade or the exchange was worth it to them. Whatever they gave up was less to them than whatever they received from the exchange. Marx says, let's concede that. Just stipulate that market transactions really are both mutually voluntary and mutually beneficial. Yet there's still a problem. And the problem, he thinks, is a moral problem. And here's the moral problem. It's effectuated by those successful exchanges that are mutually voluntary, mutually beneficial, are effectuated through manipulation on the one hand, maybe even lying, and through instrumentality, meaning I don't view you as a person, certainly not a person equal to me. What I view you as is a tool for me to achieve what I want. So in talking to you, what I figure out is, what do you want? And I come up with a way to produce something you want. But the object of my production, Marx says, is not really the thing I'm producing. It's really you, or the thing that I want you to do for me. So it's really a kind of manipulation. I treat you not like a person with human dignity equal to me or on par with me, a moral agent on par with me. Instead, I'm just treating you as another tool in the environment that I can use to achieve my own goals, whatever they are. Maybe you're a particularly complicated tool. You're more complicated than a screwdriver or a hammer. So what I have to do to get you to operate the way I want you to operate might take a little more work and a little more effort. But you're just like all the other tools. And so that's a different sort of criticism of that. It's not just that it's selfish on both of our sides, which Marx also says, and Smith says we address ourselves not to the butcher, the brewer, the baker's humanity, but to their self-love. So it's not just the selfishness; it's this sort of manipulation and treating as if you were a mere means to my ends. Um, but I think that too is a misreading of that passage. It's not understanding the rest of the passage, because think about the alternative that to what Smith is proposing. So Smith says we address ourselves to the self-love or the self-interest of the butcher, the brewer, the baker. Come up with something that you value, that I can provide for you, and that you, in exchange for which you'll provide something for me that I value. What Smith is suggesting is, I mean, so think about the alternative to that. What's the alternative? If you have something I want, and what Smith is saying is, I address myself. I mean, note that term. I address myself. I talk to you of your advantages. Talking, persuading, making an argument. What's the alternative to that method of trying to execute an exchange? Killing, stealing, enslaving, conquest. Those are the alternatives. So the first thing I think to say is that, well, if those are the alternatives, even if Marx is right about the I'm really just seeing you as a complicated tool, the result is much better. It's much better to figure out a way to engage in mutually voluntary and mutually beneficial cooperation than it is the alternative, which is the tried and true method for basically all of human history. Of as soon as one person or one group has enough power over another, they just conquer. They just steal them, enslave them, take their things. If that's the alternative, this is clearly much better. But the other part of it, and this is what I would add to your interpretation of Smith, is to really focus in on, home in on that address myself to. I address myself to their interests. I think that part of it is a way of, on the Smithian view, showing actual respect to the other person. Because it's a way of recognizing, of signaling that I recognize that you have interests of your own. Yes, there are things that I want, but so do you. I don't know what those are, and you don't know what mine are. But when I address myself to your interests, what I'm saying is I understand that you have interests. Maybe you have obligations, responsibilities. You too have scarce resources. You have goals and desires you'd like to achieve that outstrip the resources you have. So you're constantly working, as I am too, trying to do a constrained optimization problem where how do we achieve the most of our goals within given the constraints we face. I don't know all the details of those, but when I address myself to your interests, what I'm trying to do is to say to you, I recognize that you are a person like me who is working under constraints like me, and your values and your interests and your position is just as important to you as mine. All of that is to me. So that in the hopes of having, if we can have a successful, mutually voluntary, mutually beneficial exchange, that can only happen through the process of each of us recognizing the other as being a possessor of all of those values, interests, and within the constraints, and as having the moral right to say no thanks. I mean, the beautiful part of that is that you don't always have to say yes to a proposal. If I make a proposal to you and you don't like it, you can say no thanks and go down the road. If I allow that to happen, if we as a society allow anybody to say no to anybody else, to any proposal or offer, proposition they make, that, it seems to me, and this is something I think Marx missed, but that seems to me is a spectacular way to recognize the equal moral agency of other human beings. I mean, I would put that, Smith doesn't use this language, but I would put that in the terms of recognizing the human dignity of every other human being. I can make you an offer. I respect you as a moral agent by trying to make an argument to you or trying to persuade you. But if you say no, or if you counter and we can have a discussion, but if you at the end of the day say no, then I will respect that. That's not just me respecting your saying no, that's me respecting you. And I think that's a way of showing respect to other human beings that puts you on a par with me and with everybody else.
Yeah, what you're making me think of there just for a second was that well, let me wind it back. We, we reverse just a little bit here. So we don't really talk about politics per se here very much. We've just gone through an election earlier in the week, and that election featured a lot of talk about economic issues, including things like affordability of housing in New York City and things like that. And it seems to me that in these conversations, we often, I think sometimes intentionally, conflate the descriptive and proscriptive versions of things, prescriptive rather, versions of things, the analytic and the normative. So when you were talking about instrumentalizing people, what that really made me think of was Say's law. This notion that we produce in order to consume. Now, that's not really a moral statement. That's a statement about, to use a phrase, how the world works.
Yeah.
That whether you are
It's a claim about
a
human
good
nature.
person,
Yeah.
a good person whose heart is full of love for humanity, or a mean and petty person whose heart is full of nothing but self-interest and smallness, um, the economics still works the same either way. You're producing something because you have consumptive needs of your own, and that's how you go about meeting your needs. And that's all good and fine. But we end up having these really, what seem to me, maybe in a sense, literally meaningless conversations about these notions like, well, someone will say, well, we should think of healthcare as a right. Healthcare is a human right. And just from an analytical point of view, that doesn't make any sense because, like, healthcare is constrained by scarcity. There's so many doctors, so many hospital beds. It costs so much in terms of resources to produce this or that pharmaceutical. And taking a moralistic view of it doesn't change any of the underlying physical realities or any of the underlying financial realities. People will say, well, we should have more plentiful housing in New York City or San Francisco. Well, fixing that problem is not a matter of convincing people to agree with you as a moral matter or as an ethical matter. It's about, if you built more houses, there'd be more houses. And it seems like we often refuse to deal with this, and people maybe even intentionally retreat into these moralistic poses when faced with quantitative or physical or just plain old analytical economic truths that they don't want to talk about. Um, you know, I recently reviewed Ezra Klein's Scarcity book, which has made me want to strangle him in lots of ways, and which is a shame because his heart's in the right place, I think, and he's trying to push people of his political tendency in the right direction. But this notion that the book is based on, that scarcity is some sort of artificial thing
Hmm.
that is the result of bad public policy or lack of inventive thinking, that's the basic problem, is that people believe that, and it's not true.
Hmm.
Scarcity is just a fact of life. It's if you've got what's the story about Abraham Lincoln? He's going down the street with his four children, and one of them's crying, and someone says, "What's wrong with your kid?" And he says, "What's wrong with him is what's wrong with the world. It's that I've got 3 walnuts in my pocket and 4 kids, and everybody wants one." and and it's just not a fixable problem. I probably got the numbers there wrong somehow, but the principle of the thing is right. And so I think people go to Smith particularly with their own sets of biases and expectations, the same way they do Marx, and look for violations of their moral sense when he's talking about analytical things about how markets and labor and exchange actually work. And then when he actually is writing about moral sentiments and morality, they mix that up with an analytical kind of point of view. One thing I did want to ask you that just kind of leapt to mind when you were talking about this is a real question I have, which is going to sound snarky, but it's not meant that way because I don't know the answer to this. But you've read a lot of him. Do you think Karl Marx was smart?
Well, define smart. Did he have a high IQ? Yes, I think he did.
Okay.
I think he had he. Look, I don't want to engage too much in armchair psychology. But he grew up in a sort of pastoral place, that where there were rolling hills and forests and animals, and then he went to London in the middle of the 19th century. And what did he see in London in the middle of the 19th century? Well, you had all of these people stacked on top of one another in tiny hovels without running water and going to the bathroom in communal buckets that they dumped out in the street. And then in some cases, almost literally across the street, you would see great big mansions where people were being served meals by butlers with white gloves. And I think he asked himself, how could a system that gave rise to this possibly be just? So, I mean, was he smart? He wasn't a very good reader of Adam Smith. But what I think he was motivated by was the very visceral, and maybe many of us would have had a similar visceral response to seeing that kind of inequality, especially when the lower end of that inequality was as low as it was. I mean, likely almost nobody in the United States today would trade places with a rich person in 19th century London. I mean, we might think we would, but if you knew any details about the way they lived, you wouldn't.
If you knew what it smelled like.
If you knew what it smelled like, I mean, they still didn't have running water either,
Yeah.
let alone antibiotics and the internet. but I think that actually, that sort of visceral reaction to great disparity is something that might be part of the human condition. I mean, I have a theory about that, and maybe this connects with what you were talking about. I have a theory about, our sort of Stone Age brains. We are a small group species that evolved at a time where we were in relatively small bands, in fact, quite small bands, 50 to 150, something like that. Um, Always or frequently at the edge of starvation or at subsistence, facing imminent threat from other small bands that we ran into. In conditions like that, what kinds of psychological instincts would have been selected for over hundreds or thousands of generations? Among them, one could speculate, and it is a bit of speculation, but there's some evidence that might support it. Would be anything that any of us caught or killed would be shared equally, because even though you killed today, you won't get the kill tomorrow, and we're all very close to the margin here, so we share. And if any one of our small band or groups started to accumulate anything that looked like a little bit more than what other people had, well, what were the possible explanations of that? One was you caught something and you weren't sharing, and since we're all at the brink of starvation or close to it, that's basically a capital offense. Or what's the other one? You're cavorting with some enemy tribe and you're being bought off and you're about to enable them to come and to conquer us, kill our men, take our resources, etc. So I think it's plausible. I wouldn't say decisive, but it's plausible to think that we are the inheritors of exactly those instincts. So when we see, I mean, we can sort of test it anecdotally, but when you see somebody who has a lot more money than you do, what's your first reaction? Is your first instinctive reaction to think, good for that person? He must be really doing great for the world. Or is it to think, why does that jerk get that and not me? And I think for a lot of people, it's the latter, not the former. And maybe that's sort of tied in with a view that wealth, and I don't know if this is Ezra Klein's view, but I think maybe sort of behind it is the idea that wealth and prosperity in the world are really zero sum. So it's almost as if it's sort of fixed, so that if you become a billionaire, the only way you can become a billionaire is having extracted it at someone else's expense. And so even if we don't know what you did wrong to become a billionaire, we know that you did something wrong. So this idea you mentioned that scarcity is a fact of the world, and I think when you have a conversation with just about anybody and explain the sort of the economics conception of scarcity, they're going to understand that. Oh yeah, of course. Everybody, no matter how much you have, everybody wants more, and not all of their desires can be satisfied at the same time. People understand that. But on the other hand, listen to the way people talk about the rich and the wealthy. They talk about it in a way that makes it sound as if they took it, they stole it from somebody. Somewhere along the way, they benefited themselves at another person's expense. So, going back to what we were talking about before about the mutually voluntary and mutually beneficial transactions that can happen in a market economy, that mutually beneficial, people are that's hard. I mean, you can explain it in a classroom and people understand, or with a textbook, but the minute they go out into the real world, it's as if that goes away. The world seems to return to them as zero sum, and inequality must be through some kind of malfeasance. And those, I think, maybe hardwired is too strong a term, but those are deep seated in the human psychology, and I think that's very difficult to overcome.
Well, I think that's the interesting thing about your profession is that I think that people underappreciate the necessity of moral education, that we're born with certain instincts and inclinations that don't always point us in the right direction, and that these things have to be educated. They have to be perfected and pointed in the right direction and refined and developed in various kinds of ways. There's this sort of, noble savage myth that we're born kind of good and authentic and that we can trust our instincts about this kind of stuff. Although I've noted over the years that when you talk to kind of relatively well-off college-educated people about inequality, they always talk about rich people and not poor people. And the rich people were the problem, and not solving poverty. Poverty were the challenge before us. And my read on that is that the most intense hatred of kind of billionaires and Silicon Valley types and Wall Street types that I've encountered in my life, is always from people who are socially adjacent to that class of people, but not economically part of it.
Mm.
So, if you're a high achieving academic, or a head of a big nonprofit or something like that, you make a fine living. You're flying business class, you go to Davos, you do that kind of stuff. But you don't have, Jeff Bezos type money. You don't have Elon Musk type money. And people who make $35,000 a year don't ever talk, in my experience anyway, about how much they hate Jeff Bezos. Now, people who make $250,000 a year really, really hate Jeff Bezos or people like that. And it's because for the low income people, you may as well be talking about, you know, figures from Greco-Roman mythology. They're just this different kind of world. But a lot of us, including people like me, I grew up in a quite low income household in a pretty low income area. But given my profession and what I've done over the years, I know a lot of people who are in that world, who are people who have gone on to start companies or have these kinds of crazy corporate jet kind of lifestyles, and they're demystified for people like us, because we kind of know who they are, and it wasn't this magical thing they did. They just took a different path in life. And I've seen this in the nonprofit world, especially, a lot where you've got nonprofit managers and policy scholars and things like that who are pretty smart people, and their self conception is based on being smart, and then they're supported by donors who made a lot of money having car dealerships in Fort Worth, Texas, or something like that, but they made $100 million doing it, and their attitude is, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? And on the other side of the fence, you get, you're awfully rich. Why aren't you smart?
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
these are just different kinds of ways of being in the world.
Well, that's very similar to what to Joseph Schumpeter's discussion about how it is that capitalism will come to an end. Why capitalism sows the seeds of its own destruction. It sounds like you're giving a theory like that, that the you know that
For those who don't know the story, tell it, please.
yes. Well, so he says that what capitalism will do is it upsets older hierarchies. So it may have been in the past that you had, the king was at the top, or the pharaoh, the emperor was at the top um, with the small family, but the other people who were at the top with the king and the pharaoh were the clerics or the religious or the scholars, the academics, who were the advisors to the king. Well, what happens in capitalism is that people from all walks of life, from anywhere, can succeed, and suddenly they have as much wealth as the king used to have. And where does that leave those scholars, clerics, academics? It's not clear what their place in society is. So they don't have the clear route to the money, and they don't have the clear route to the authority anymore, and it generates resentment in them. And it's made all the worse, according to Schumpeter, when the academics who are intelligent people meet the business people, and they say, wait, you don't have the credentials I have, you don't have the diplomas I have, you don't have the IQ I have, and yet you have 100 times as much wealth as I have. This system must be wrong, that could enable someone like you to have more authority than someone like me, especially if that means now that I'm somehow dependent on you. If I have to come to you and say, please give me some of your surplus wealth so that I can do the good things that I know I could do, and I can't get it in any other way. It just generates an enormous amount of resentment, which will then grow in society, Schumpeter thinks, until the point where that resentment gets translated to children and to students, and the students then imbibe that resentment, and that can then lead to the demise of capitalism.
Yeah. How we talk about work is often presented as a conversation about money when it's really a conversation about status. And because for a society like ours, in which it's a quite wealthy society, there's a lot of difference between being in that top 1,000th of 1%, the yacht and private plane money. But like if you're in the top 10%, top 15% of a society like ours, you're doing real well. You've got a real comfortable life, and you're not really competing for material resources in the sense that there's you don't need a bigger house or better food or something like that. And in fact, you probably eat the same food 9 meals out of 10 that the wealthiest people in the world do. You probably don't live in as nice a house as some of these guys do, and you got to fly commercial, which is the worst part of not being a billionaire. As I keep coming back to,
That's
longtime
the
listeners of
great
this podcast
injustice.
will hit the theme. But your life isn't really radically all that different from theirs in a lot of the quotidian stuff. But there's the status issue that's of course enormously different. And I wonder if you think, as I think, that how we talk about work and how we think about work is often very dysfunctional and unhealthy, in part because we are very anxious about these status questions, but we're very uncomfortable talking about them.
Yeah. No, I think that's an interesting point, and I think status, unlike wealth, is a zero sum game, or is largely a zero sum game. So if I rise in status, that means somebody else is going down. And so that brings out both the competitiveness among some people, but also resentment if you think you should be higher than you are, and that can generate that in a different way. Now there are people who argue that, well, okay, in a commercial society, I think Johann Norberg makes this argument that in a commercial society, yes, the desire for status is zero sum, but what you can get is many different margins of status. So I can be, one of the best professors of business ethics, which is a different margin from being the best podcaster in the world, the best journalist in the world, the best, I don't know, supplier of electric vehicles. So they're very different margins, and maybe that can satisfy us to say, well, okay, I'm not playing in that game, I'm playing in this other game, and the game I'm playing in, and maybe there's something to that, but I think it's hard for us not to still, whatever margin we're on, A, it is still within the margin, it's still zero sum. But B, it's hard for us not to sort of look over our shoulders and see the people in those other margins, and then give ourselves the self-congratulatory. Well, I'm really better than that person. I'm smarter than that person. Surely I could do that just as well. So why is it that that person is the one who's getting that and I'm only getting this? Even if relative to my margin I'm doing well, relative in absolute terms, related to that person, I'm not doing nearly as well.
Yeah. One of the great favors someone did me in life was being very frank with me that I was not good at something when I was younger. When I was
That's
when
valuable
I was an
advice.
when I was an undergraduate, I was an economics major for like a semester and a half, or something like that. And a professor took me aside and he said, "You really don't need to do this. You shouldn't do this." He said, "Do you know what you do with an undergraduate degree in economics?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, you get a doctorate in economics. You get a graduate degree, which basically means getting a graduate degree in math. Does that sound like fun to you?" No, it really doesn't. You're like, you're a journalist. Go be a journalist. You can write about this stuff. Read books in your spare time. You'll like it. It'll be fun. But you don't
Yeah.
need to.
Well,
You don't need
that's
to.
turned out well for you, I think.
Well, it turned out just fine. And he was right. I'm not very good at math, but more to the point, I don't enjoy it that much. And I don't want to do it all day. What else do you think we get wrong in how we talk and think about work, and how can we improve that conversation? I think it's just an enormously important social issue.
I agree. I think a lot of things, but I'll maybe mention one, or I'll start with one. I think the discussion of this phrase work-life balance, I don't like the way that's discussed, and for several reasons. But one of them is that what that makes it seem as if is the work you do is sort of the necessary evil to enable you to get on with your life. And I think that's a bad way of approaching what you do, how you lead your life as an adult. Many students think about, if they're thinking about going into business, thinking about going into finance, marketing, accounting, whatever it is, they tell themselves stories, or they believe that, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a lot of money for 10 or 15 years, and then I'm going to stop, or I'm going to pivot, and then I'm going to really start living. So that at that point, I'll give some of my wealth away to good causes. Maybe then I have a family, maybe then I travel, maybe I retire early and at the age of 45 or 50 or something because I've made enough money. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. I think it's a much better way to think about the life you're going to lead as being an integrated life, professionally, personally, socially, integrated into a single life of meaning and purpose. And they shouldn't be in contest. So that doesn't mean that there aren't trade-offs you have to make. That happens. But they shouldn't be in conflict with one another. And if the work you do in your professional life is something that you see the only value of that is that it enables you to do something else, then I think that's a pretty bold red flag that maybe you should think about doing something else. You haven't found what I think of as your calling. I teach at a Catholic university. I talk in terms of finding a calling. I say things like, God, you are made in the image and likeness of God. God created you as a unique soul. And there's going to be some good, some value you can create in the world uniquely literally only you can provide to the world. You should figure out what that is. And once you figure out what that is, pursue it. And then all the other things in your life should be able to make sense to you given that role. So it shouldn't be that you're trying to lead different lives. You want to be virtuous in the evenings and on the weekends, but then, and the rest of the time, that's sort of, when I'm on the job, I'm a totally different person. No, you're just one person. And your work should be integrated into that single life of meaning and purpose that you're pursuing. So I think I don't like thinking about these things as being separate buckets and that you sort of go from one bucket to another bucket to another bucket for all kinds of reasons, but especially because I think it robs us of the ability of thinking about our lives as a journey towards, as I say, meaning and purpose, all of the pieces of it integrating into that.
Yeah. The idea of an integrated life, economically and spiritually integrated life, is very prominent in certain Catholic circles, of course, and so you hear a lot of that at Notre Dame, I imagine. What do we know about Adam Smith's religious opinions and how they influenced his thinking?
It's a good question. It's a contested question among scholars. So he was raised in the Scotch Presbyterian Kirk. And in his first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of reference, especially in the first edition of that book, which came out in 1759. Lots of references to the author of nature, capital A. He capitalizes nature, and he talks about the judge of the universe, capital J. Over the subsequent editions, so he made 6 editions of that book. They came out during his lifetime. He softened a lot of those over the subsequent editions, and so scholars wonder why. What does that mean? One speculation, I think it is a speculation, is he became friends with David Hume, and over the years the influence of Hume sort of beat that out of him a little bit. So there's a lot of disagreement among scholars. I'll give you just my own view about that. I don't think he ever abandoned his belief in God. And one reason for that is that in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, he tries to figure out, how is it that human beings come? He's trying to approach it as something like an empirical psychologist, a moral psychologist. How is it that human beings come to have the moral sentiments they have? And he thinks that there are a couple of sort of fixed features of humanity that enable human beings to form not only their own moral sentiments, but to form them in community with others. And for Smith, I think the question becomes, so even after he spells all this out and the mechanism by which we come to have a communal system standard of morality, even after he spells all of that out, the question for him becomes, well, why do we have these these particular instincts at all? Why is it that we're able to develop moral sentiments that allow us to come into commerce, both moral and economic commerce with other human beings that can be both peaceful and productive? And he thinks the answer to that is that God must have put that in us. The theory of evolution was not available to him. That wasn't going to come for the next century. But I think he thinks that human beings are constructed in such a way that they can develop positive and productive moral sentiments. Things can go wrong in many ways, but it is possible for us to develop a system of virtues that enables us to live both peacefully and cooperatively with one another by following these virtues and these various conventions that we can develop. And the only way, I think he thinks, the only way we could have developed those is if we had the right sort of equipment to begin with, which I think he thinks must have come from God. There's no other explanation for him available to him for that. So I think he held on. I think he held on to his religious beliefs.
It may just be an effect of the period, but his prose style reminds me of Thomas Jefferson a lot,
Oh.
and particularly in the capitalizing author and judge and that sort of thing. The way Jefferson, of course, Jefferson was a man of unorthodox religious views. Walt Whitman, over the course of his life, published just a whole bunch of different versions of Leaves of Grass. And if you compare them as he goes through, what you'll discover is that he was a terrible editor of his own work and a terrible reviser of his own work. And every edition he made somewhat worse than the brilliant first edition. Was Smith a good reviser of his work?
That's a good question. I guess I would say most of his revisions were extensions. There were a couple of passages, and scholars like to focus on the one or two passages that he cut out. So there was some, there was a passage on atonement and the need for atonement that was in the first edition of the Theory of Moral Sentiments that had an awful lot of very heavily sort of, Calvinistic fire and brimstone in it. We're worms before God and this sort of thing. And they cut that whole thing out.
Hmm.
But aside from that particular passage and a few other places, most of what he did was, I think, was in the with the intent of trying to explain his points more clearly because people had misunderstood. So he provided more examples. He tried to apply, added a whole section in the final edition of the Theory of Moral Sentiments where he talked about the character of a virtuous person. What does a virtuous person actually look like, based on the theory that he had given, and that was new. So I don't think that was a change. I think that was more of an extension. Does that make him good or bad? I mean, he didn't really, he was given to very long sentences with very long, lots of clauses. So it's a bit laborious to read at times. But the examples he was able to come up with were fantastic examples. People have gotten tenure writing about just a few of the examples and trying to pull them out, and figure out what they're about. So I don't know what the answer to that is. Was he a good editor or a bad editor? I am somebody who has come to believe in the value of a good editor. That's one thing. Division of labor is a real thing.
Hmm.
I suppose I'm, as egocentric as any good author, where I think every word that comes out is infinitely valuable. But a good editor can help you see that you don't need nine examples for this one point, and maybe you went on a little too long. So I think if he had an editor, if he had had somebody else who edited him, I think it would have maybe have benefited him. I will say, Hume, I think, was very good at that. So Hume started
Hmm.
out, the Treatise of Human Nature is very long and it's a bit meandering, and I mean it's brilliant, but he himself realized, oh my gosh, that book is just because as he said, it fell dead born from the press. Nobody paid any attention to it. So he realized it was too long, it was too complicated, it was too abstruse. So he rewrote it in a series of smaller pieces, and those are fantastic. So he, I think, is maybe the par excellence editor of his own work. Smith, I don't think, was quite up to that standard.
Yeah, that's what I've told my agents and publishers over the years. This is, my work is just too profound. That's why it doesn't sell.
That's right.
It's not that it's
Yeah.
not that it's defective, but so let's say I'm an 18-year-old undergraduate at Notre Dame. I've just finished my first semester, and Professor Ottison's my favorite professor at the school. And I'm starting from zero. I don't know what I want to do. I'm not from a particularly wealthy or particularly impoverished background. If I have any great gifts or talents, I don't know what they are yet. I'm not sure what it is I want to do with my life. I have economic needs, obviously, that I'm going to have to think about coming out of school, but I also have a sense that I want to do something that's fulfilling and that gives my life some sense of significance, and that the job and career that I choose is going to be part of this, at least. I mean, there'll be other things as well. There's family and church and community and being a citizen and all the rest of those things. But I don't know what to do with my life, and I don't know how to go about setting up the procedure for making those decisions. But I've got to make decisions. I've got to pick a major. I've got to take classes. I've got to decide if I'm going to do this internship or this summer job. I've got to make all these decisions that are going to have some effect on that. Probably not as big an effect as it seems like when you're 18 and everyone's telling you what college you get into is going to be the thing that determines the rest of your life. What do you tell that 18-year-old how to think about his future career and work and its role in his life?
That's a good question. I have conversations like that quite often, actually, with students. The first thing I tell them is to take a breath, relax a little bit. You're young, you don't have any real responsibilities at the moment. when you graduate from Notre Dame, you are not going to be homeless no matter what you do. So you have a little bit of time, you have a little bit of grace, take a breath. And then I would say to back out a little bit and ask yourself, well, what would be the ideal, thinking about whatever line of work I might go into, whatever profession I might go into, what would be the ideal? What people will say is follow your passion. Okay. Um, Here's what I would say. There are actually three things to think about, not one. So, one is yes, what's something that you really love doing, and I don't mean that it's fun or that you kind of like it. I mean something where you get lost in it when you do it. You lose time doing it because you don't realize time has passed because you're so involved in it. So, what are some of those things? And there should be. If there isn't something like that, then we have a different conversation. But there should be something where you find yourself that you love doing it. That's one thing. But there are two other things that people often don't think about. Second thing is, what are you actually good at? So oftentimes we love to do things, we're not so good at them. Sometimes we're good at things that we don't really love doing. Now those things often coincide, what you love and what you're good at, but they don't always. So what do you love? What are you good at? And then the third thing is, what do other people value that you do for them? Now, if you can put those three things together, then you're really at the golden place. So figure out, and other people matter too. So it's not only about you. So don't tell me, I have a passion for this. That's great, but that's not all, because you're not the only person on earth, and you have to live in society and community with other people too. And you should take their interests into account, not exclusively, but they're part of it. So think about all three of those things. What do you love? What are you good at? And then what would other people value you doing? That might mean that you make some trade-offs on one of those margins to hit the center of that, but there will be something at the center of that. So try to think in terms of all three of those, and then give yourself a little bit of time and grace. If you came here thinking you had to major in medicine or law or finance because that's what other people told you or that's what other people expected you to do, give yourself a chance to think about it. Don't be so risk averse, to go back to our conversation before. Once you have a family and children, and you're responsible for supporting them, then it's much more difficult to take on risks. But right now, the whole world is open. So don't be afraid of failure. Your first job won't be your last job. You're going to have many changes and many pivots. Give yourself a little chance to explore, to find what's at the center of those three things. And in your 4 years here, you will find that. You will find something, at least a really good first approximation. And you pursue that a little bit, and maybe that turns out to be the thing you'll be doing 40 years from now. Maybe it won't be. But if you think about it, if you give yourself a chance to explore around for that, then you're setting yourself up with a pretty good chance.
Yeah. Got to be careful when you tell that 18-year-old to relax. Someone told me that when I was 18, and I took them at their word, and I just kind of never stopped.
Well, I
That
think
was the
this generation might be a little more anxious about things than I don't know, than my generation was. We were a little more
what
chill.
um what year did you graduate from high school?
High school, 86, 1986.
86. That was a pretty good year to graduate from high school. I finished in 91, and then I left the university in 1996. And I think that those accidents of timing just have a huge
I
influence on
think
people.
that's right. Yeah.
I left college. I didn't graduate, but I left college in probably the best year in American history to be entering the workforce. I mean,
90s were a pretty good that was a pretty good decade.
90s we're killing it, and but I think that had a profound influence on a whole generation's sense of risk aversion, their sense of economic optimism,
100%.
their sense of the role of entrepreneurship and those sorts of things, and and then all these kids who were getting out of school around the time of the financial crisis
Oh yeah.
and recession after that,
Yeah.
they are scarred.
Yeah.
And even though they are in absolute material terms doing better than we were probably at their age, just because of the
Mhm.
wealthier world that it was, um, they're really dour. And
Yeah,
and
that is one economic event that they remember. So they don't they so today's college students, today's college freshmen don't remember 9/11. If you talk about 9/11, it might as well be Kennedy being shot or people wearing togas. They have no idea what that is. But the 08, 09 economic downturn, they remember that, and they also remember the story that they were told about that, which was that capitalism went off the rails and had to be rescued by the federal government. And that is something that's deeply ingrained in them. And I think, and I'm psychologizing a bit here, but that event, both the story about the cause and the solution, I think has had a very big effect on their risk aversion now. Many of them, and that's something I think I've noticed since I've been a professor, is how much less willing students are to take risks. They want to follow tried and true paths. They don't think about, well, I want to start my own company. They think about, I must get a job at an already existing company that has been there a long time and will be there forever. And so they're much less willing to take risks, and I think they're worried in part because, as you said, that economic downturn in 08, 09, that they remember.
Yeah, we've got a whole generation of Germans that we didn't mean to create. Essentially, where they're very institutional minded. They're like big organizations
Mhm.
and things like that.
Yeah.
But the tragedy of that, well, one of the many tragedies of that era and that episode, was that, like the Great Depression and the New Deal, there was an immediate mythology that was created in the aftermath of it that's not true, but it's what everyone believes, and it's the thing that really politically controls, I think, the economic thinking and the economic policy thinking of that generation. That it's just an enormous, enormous presence there. In the same way that you could have a figure like Ronald Reagan, who was, Mr. Capitalism and all that stuff, but he always considered himself a New Deal Democrat,
Mm.
and his political hero wasn't Barry Goldwater, and it wasn't Dwight Eisenhower. It was Franklin Roosevelt,
FDR. Yeah.
and that was his guy. And I grew up not too far from New Deal, Texas, and
Oh, is that
when
right?
you're
Okay.
naming your towns after government programs, those things have
That has a
some extent.
resonance. Yeah.
Yeah, those farmers out there, they took it pretty hard in the depression and the years leading up to it. In fact, there was kind of an ag depression that started before what we normally think of as the wider Great Depression. And I'm afraid that no matter what we do, no matter what we write, and no matter how many books we put out on this stuff, those kids who have that mythology about the financial crisis and the Great Recession are just never going to be talked out of it. It's just part of it's an article of religious faith almost at this point.
Yeah. Well, I don't think either one of us should ever give up hope in our search for the truth.
No, we gotta keep doing it.
Yeah.
Well, I could do this for hours and hours, and maybe we will sometime. But I know you've got a life to get back to, and I appreciate the investment of your time here on the podcast. Anything you want to add before we close out? Anything I didn't bring up that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah. One thing I would like to say is to all the listeners, read Kevin Williams's work. It's phenomenal. I've been reading it for years since I was a graduate student. I think when I started reading you. I don't remember exactly, but right around the late '90s, early 2000s. I don't know exactly when you came to my attention, but read your work, and it continues. There are very few people, and I mean this with all sincerity. There are very few people who can continue to write day after day, week after week, month after month, and have each thing still be interesting and not just the same thing that they've been saying for the last 20 years. But you are one of those few people, so your work is
That's
eminently
very kind
worth
of you to
reading.
say. People sometimes ask me about my work output and how I write so much, and I always give them the same answer, which is no choice.
Necessity is a heck of a thing.
Yeah, that's how it works. Thank you again for your time. I look forward to seeing you again sometime soon.
Likewise. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you.
Take care. That concludes our most recent episode of How the World Works. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jim Otteson as much as I did. If you'd like to watch a video of our conversation, you can do that on YouTube. There will be a link to it in the show notes. Thanks again for taking the time to listen, and we will talk to you next month.